It's not very often we get a glimpse into the unique and interesting non-Korean or Japanese Eastern world of online gaming, with the majority of these type of games coming from Korea. China, however, has arguably the biggest video game audience or consumer audience period, especially with their mobile audience, which numbers in the hundreds of millions. Recently, some Chinese games or Chinese-inspired games have made their way to the West and are finding some great success. While Chinese entertainment has been popular in the West since the 80s, their video games or animated series haven't. Chinese media finding success recently could be attributed to a number of reasons, but the simplest just being exposure, as not all Eastern games are also released in the West, China being one of the worst offenders of such. Particularly in online RPGs, China has been lacking, especially with a powerful global presence like Japan has with Final Fantasy XIV. Perfect World Entertainment might be one of the biggest counterexamples, but it's also one of the few. Revolution Online, for example, was another, a Chinese mythology-fueled MMO that could unfortunately also be featured on this series. Things were supposed to be different though, with the first online game in the, and forgive my Chinese, but Guian series. Guian was a popular Final Fantasy-like Zhanxia, an epic story that blends martial arts and godly elements together. Guian Qitan Online, as it would be dubbed in China, being the fourth game in the overall series, would launch back in 2019 and reach arguably the greatest success for a Chinese MMO or online RPG yet. So much so that it would net in a Western launch, first being renamed to Swords of Legends Online and then being launched in July of 2021. After 2 years of being live, Swords of Legends Online would be shut down in the West. Guian Qitan, or Swords of Legends Online in the East, though, is still around and kicking. Which makes this a mystery of why didn't Swords of Legends Online make a lasting mark in the Western market. On this episode of Death of a Game, we take a look into one of the highest profile Eastern ports, especially out of China, and why it failed to find its footing in the Western market. Pay attention throughout the video as we navigate the timeline for the clues and pick up bits of evidence that present themselves. That's because we're gonna need those for the end of the video, for the final deduction, every detective's favorite part of the mystery. For now, detectives, we take a journey to the world of Zhanxia and Chinese video gaming. I'd like to welcome this video's sponsor, Life is Feudal MMO. Life is Feudal MMO is a very hardcore game where surviving alone is almost impossible. Each character has their own unique specializations both in peace and in war, and to make your journey more comfortable, developers start you out in one of the game's guilds where you can cooperate with the other players. During peacetime, you and other players can explore the world, collect resources, and craft equipment. During the hour of war, you switch to your combat profession and fight with other players against another guild. Guilds are a big part of Life is Feudal. Guild membership is one of the most important game mechanics that allows you to interact with other players, but the possibilities really are endless. Life is Feudal MMO is a massive world known as Abella, and has over 37 massive regions, the area of the map measuring to 21 kilometers by 21 kilometers. The game is also a sandbox, which really ups the amount of things that you can do in the game. Each player is free to define their own goals and ambitions, from farmer's lifestyle to building castles and political intrigue between major guilds. And best of all, there's no pay-to-win features. Life is Feudal has relaunched, with the game having shut down originally back in 2021. Now being launched under a new owner, Longtail Games, and launched as a hardcore subscription game. So if you missed the chance to play Life is Feudal the first time around, well, fear not. You've got another chance. Remember to check out the link in the description to download the game and check it out for yourself, and be among the first to experience the return of the legend. The story of Swords of Legends Online begins with the first entry in the Guian series, which launched far back in July of 2010. Guian was developed by Shanghai developer Arugon, and although it started as a humble series, would receive a sequel in August of 2013, where the game was significantly improved upon and expanded. Guian might be rather unknown to non-Chinese players, but it was only continuing to grow in popularity by the end of 2013. By September of 2014, the success would result in a TV show, a hit TV show I might add, dubbed Swords of Legends. Swords of Legends would go on to an impressive 52 episodes. Even Guian 2 would get its own spin-off media, this time in the form of a movie, dubbed Legend of the Ancient Sword. While these are relatively unknown to Westerners, the reason that I bring them up is that it shows the level of success and cultural permeation of Guian in China. You don't see games getting spin-off shows and movies unless they are super popular, and that momentum would result in their most successful and arguably most ambitious Guian entry yet, Guian 3. GJ3 would launch December 2018 and get easily the most global attention, and in my opinion, setting most of what would become the direction and art style of what would be their fourth game later on. Just like Ultima, Phantasy Star, and Warcraft saw successes as franchises before they were online MMOs or RPGs, Guian was right behind these, with Oregon launching an online RPG version of the game sometime in 2019 in China only. Guian Khitan Online would take China by storm, easily becoming the most popular Chinese online RPG. Being unique as not only was it featuring Chinese lore, it was developed by a Chinese company. The game would garner global attention unlike any other Guian title, resulting in calls for a Western release. Developer Oregon would be faced with an option. If they wanted to bring Guian Khitan Online to the West, they would have to adapt the game heavily, both in the form of localization, which is not just a process of translation, it's also a process of cultural translation in a sense, and well, with just how they were selling the game, for example, the very name of the game. Instead of doing this themselves, like many Asian developers choose, they contracted a Western developer, in this case, Gameforge, to do such. Gameforge wasn't without some marks on its reputation, being the German publisher behind Runes of Magic, often labeled a heavy pay-to-win game, and many more games as you can see on screen. This didn't inherently mean that the Western version of Guian Online would be pay-to-win, but it didn't do the game any favors with setting expectations, especially because most Western players had no exposure to Chinese culture or online games. This is significant because Guian Online in China was actually never pay-to-win. This was an annoying stereotype that I ran into when I started covering the game early on, when I heard that it was coming to the West. People automatically assume that all Asian games are the same. Thus, because Korean games have pay-to-win features and Japan invented gacha, well, China must be right behind them, right? In some ways, sure. Gacha and mobile are probably the biggest in their markets and most successful in the entirety of the world. But in the case of China, and at least Guian Online, it was never a pay-to-win game. And the truth doesn't always matter, though. Sometimes proper marketing matters more. It was going to be up to Oregon and their Western developer of choice, Gameforge, to help combat that. With Guian Online, there wasn't just issues of players not understanding the story, there were concerns that players wouldn't be aware of what kind of game they were even getting themselves into. That's because China doesn't have a history of massive online games much like Japan, and as you will see as the episode unfolds, Guian Online wasn't really that massive, and that's relevant because of how the game was going to be sold going forward. If players expected such going in, well, they were going to be facing a rude awakening. Beta for what was now being dubbed Swords of Legends Online would take place May 14th, 2021, and I jumped at the chance to play the game. Not only was it absolutely gorgeous and had fast-paced Guild Wars 2 style gameplay and combat, I was always interested in wuxia and xianxia style stories and media, growing up obsessed with Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Much like probably everybody else. My first impressions of Swords of Legends Online was just what I thought and had expected going in just about, which was that the gameplay was impressive and the visuals were first in class, as expected at this point from Chinese games. My only concerns early on, though, were about the style of game that Solo was turning out to be, and how it was being sold. For example, all Western publications of the game were already being written and selling the game as an MMORPG. This is annoying for me because oftentimes it isn't even the fault of the developers themselves, like how Final Fantasy XIV doesn't even call itself an MMO on its website, but that's what most people familiar with it are going to call it. And thus, they call it something that vaguely describes what they play. But sometimes media outlets are to blame, as they immediately start calling a game an MMO as soon as it has a chat feature, a friends list, and allows for players to just play the same game. In the case of Swords of Legends Online, I'm gonna put the blame more on Gameforge. If you read the promotional material, it seemed quite clear from the very jump that they wanted to sell the game as an MMORPG, and that's what they were familiar with, to be fair. The issue I have with this is that Swords of Legends Online isn't a massive game. It basically doesn't even have massive content. Sure, raids can be anywhere from 10 to 20 players, but the overworld map is effectively the tutorial leveling experience. I mean, even the world map looked more like a Pokemon map than anything, and this is coming from someone that not only tested the game, but reached max level. As much as some dorks like to pretend that definitions don't matter because they don't have the brain power to comprehend them or the usefulness of them, this is an exact case where proper descriptions and proper marketing would have done wonders for the game. I remember during beta hearing tons of players complaining about this exact issue, about how the game barely seemed like an MMO, and so on and so forth. The curse of expectation was real, and Swords of Legends Online being sold day one as a massive online RPG was setting poor expectations for those jumping into it. Improper marketing or not, the game would continue to launch on its targeted launch date of July 9th, 2021. Solo, as the acronym would go, would cost a box price and no sub fee, and have no pay-to-win microtransactions in the cash shop, which means that it was cosmetic only. This was a rather fair proposition, all things considered, especially flying in the face of the whole Chinese games must be worse at monetization than Western ones. No, sorry, not this one at least. I was a day one purchaser, as I felt like I saw enough positives to find my level to max experience at least good enough, right? Anything past that, I didn't know. That's kind of my personal bar whenever I'm playing in online RPGs. Can I play it for a month? Cool. If I can, then I will likely join in on the experience and enjoy it. Anything past that, though, is usually a hard bargain. Solo would score a middling 72 from only a few critics, barely being touched by popular media outlets in the West, especially the mainstream ones. This could exhibit them not only having poor structure and marketing, but just having poor marketing in general. On Steam, the title would score 66% out of 100, which was even less impressive. I unfortunately, as someone who reached max level, was able to very quickly recognize what many players would take issue with. First being the absolutely horrible localization and translation. Sorry, I just have to be blunt about it. It's one thing to translate a Xianxia story in the first place, which is incredibly complex about reaching godhood and having a hero status and vanquishing evil foes. It's very Taoist and very Chinese. And I'm simplifying it for the sake of this video, but it's fairly esoteric in comparison to wuxia even. I say that to mention that the source material is already difficult in the first place. Throw in the fact that there's clearly very few yen spent on a English translation, and you not only have hilariously bad voice acting, you have poor story presentation, and worse, just a poor story. The translations were so bad that I had to personally change my game to traditional Chinese, which was orders of magnitude better of an experience. So much so better that I started telling all of my friends to do the same and telling them that there was no questions asked. Problem being that we're tryhard players and nerds. We will play games and with translations or not, right? But that's not the majority of Western players, especially Americans who oftentimes find that they're proud of the aspect of only being able to speak one language. So many players experiencing Solo were getting a horribly translated and thus butchered version of the story, which, as it has historically done for other games ported to the West, contributed largely to ruining many players' experiences. Even worse, the leveling experience turned out to be a not-so-well-hidden tutorial. And while that's technically what all leveling processes are, in this case the leveling experience felt both trivial and very on the nose about it being a tutorial. This meant that you're spending anywhere from 30 to 50 hours leveling through a glorified tutorial that doesn't even do the best job at preparing you for the endgame content. That's because there's actually separate tutorials for that, which is great and all, but then it starts to make you question, what's the actual purpose of the leveling experience, especially if it is just supposed to be a tutorial. But at this point, Western fans were spoiled with the popularity of SWTOR, The Secret World, and even now Final Fantasy XIV being bigger in the West and having all great story experiences, including from level 1. Solo seemed like it was spending so much time and effort on presentation, but was having a boring, hand-holding, poorly translated storyline that was just turning a bunch of players off. On top of all of this, you had performance issues galore, as Solo was this incredibly gorgeous game that required a beast computer, unfortunately, to run properly. This is problematic because with online RPGs you generally want to appeal to as many players as possible. Having such a large barrier to entry would just be that, a barrier to entry that players would have to overcome, thus reducing the overall player base. It's not a surprise that the most successful MMOs or ORPGs are not really the best graphical ones, because as you chase graphics as an online RPG and fidelity in that direction, you kind of run at odds with your online massive capabilities and features, which is the other direction. Having raids and in-game PvP be the main focus of Solo wasn't exactly wrong, but having those be heavily affected by performance would also just further compound the issue. It kind of reminds me of WildStar having the whole 40-person raids, but they never actually functioned because the gameplay and combat was so laggy. The problem with this kind of approach is that if you have a 20 FPS hard mode raid, then you're probably just gonna die. The first raid, speaking of which, would be introduced July 28th, 2021, but since solo was already an existing game, the content that would be trickled in slowly, instead of being kind of like new content, would just be content that was essentially ported over. Because of such, solo in the West would always be playing catch-up with solo in the East, and this has always been a problem for games like Ion, ArcAge, and even more. Solo, through the introduction of new raids and dungeons, would attempt to keep funneling new content into their game to keep the content popping and the player base current. The problem being that the player base in the Western market had always been kind of small for solo, as peak players on Steam were only at around 18,000 players. Even though solo had spent a good portion of the first year of launch adding new content, the content didn't seem to be bringing in new players, or back old ones, at least not enough, with player counts in the 3,000s by the fall of 2021. Extreme hard mode content would be introduced sometime in September, set to accompany the newly added dungeons and raids. The issue that I have with difficulties on raids and dungeons, well, besides just having them in general, is that oftentimes they're used as a cheap, low-effort way to extend content without actually having to come up with a new encounter. In Solo's case, the challenging raids or extreme raids were actually very challenging and pretty well done, and I would even say comparable to Final Fantasy XIV. Although the game had only been out for a few months, theme park games have to constantly keep churning out new content lest the player base leave, unless you're Final Fantasy XIV. Keeping up with the content demand wasn't fatal so far for Solo, but it was leading to them slowly bleeding more and more players. Something that felt super undervalued with Solo was the PvP content. This is a personal point for me too, as I enjoyed the PvP in Solo. The problem was, well, nobody was playing it, and part of the problem was for that, well, the queuing system was kind of a strange process. You had to essentially go through unlocking parts of PvP by playing through all of it, even if it was modes that you didn't want to play. The redeeming part of the process is that they actually had a tutorial disguised as your first couple of PvP matches, where you actually were fighting against bots. I think that this is a rather clever way to onboard new players. The only problem is that the AI is so bad that when you do get matched up against actual players, you get just completely destroyed. And when I played solo PvP for the first time, I likened it to Guild Wars 2 PvP, and it actually suffered from some of the same issues, which is that it's not casual friendly. The super fast combo-based gameplay is awesome and familiar for me, but if that's the essence of the entire game and combat, well, you're just gonna immediately alienate mass amounts of players who just can't fit into that mold. And to be honest, the majority of massive online RPG players, or online RPG players in general, don't like that kind of combat. That's what made most of my friends quit. They realized because they weren't turbo enough nerds, they were essentially never going to have a way to properly experience the PvP content, especially since open world PvP wasn't really a thing. Roughly 6 months after launch, Solo would announce their first expansion, January 31st, 2022, the Firestone Legacy. As the expansion was being dubbed, would include 2 new classes, the Fox Mage and Warrior, with the Warrior split into the male-only Crystal Warrior and the female-only Spirit Warrior subclasses. It will also add new character slots and increase level cap, 2 new story chapters to bring the total to 12, and also 5 new zones, as well as 5 new dungeons, 2 new raids, and 2 new PvP maps. While this sounds quite impressive on paper, and I think it was, especially so early on in an online RPG's development, remember, the game was lacking all of this at launch, so the new ones being added were just basically filling the void. These new ones perhaps were enough to keep some players occupied for a time, but how long until the next expansion would come? With Solo West hanging behind Solo East, there were serious concerns about content issues. But worse, if the player base would continue to shrink, as it was at a super low 800 players peak already, it would only continue to shrink more, as with all online games. Once a game starts to die, people start fleeing in droves. This Firestone Legacy expansion was going to have to do more than just plug a few holes for Solo. It was going to have to bring back former players and a large wave of new ones. Solo might be still thriving in the East, but the West, it was seeing quite lackluster results, with the estimates of the sold copies being less than 300,000 total. Not only would 2.0 as Firestone Legacy was being dubbed be tasked with injecting enough content to keep players busy for a time, a quite difficult task I might add, 2.0 would also signify the change from the game being buy-to-play to free-to-play. Now there's some serious concerns about such, right? And I have to be fair about that. How would this affect the cash shop? As pay-to-win was absent from it so far, but those behind Solo West were assuring players that, well, much wouldn't change there. Solo's first expansion would launch March 3rd, 2022, and although it was tasked with a rather impossible task, I didn't expect it to fail as hard as it did. Population wouldn't even break 1,000 players peak, signaling that it seemed like Solo was already being forgotten about. Firestone Legacy was a good expansion, all things said, but it felt like a little bit too late, which felt weird because it wasn't really even that late. But players were growing wise to the concept of what ports were, especially in the context of online games. They know that more content exists in another region, sometimes they even go just play it in that region instead. But worse, sometimes it just makes the players that were playing it bitter, or feel like they're just being strung along, which I actually think is kind of fair to an extent. If their market's not actually being taken seriously and seen more as a runoff market, well, it's hard not to feel disrespected about that. Solo would drop a slew of new raids in the summer of 2022, many of which would be positively received, but at this point Solo West was receiving updates every 6 months, which for a game that was already lacking in in-game content at launch was just not enough to keep players satisfied for long. Especially the kinds of players that you were courting, which were fairly hardcore players or very achievement-minded or collector-centric kinds of players. Solo wasn't a bad game, and the new content wasn't being hated or anything, but it seemed like the majority of the player base had already moved on, whether from their experiences playing or hearing from others. The population would only continue to shrink according to Steam charts, from 900 to 500 players by August of 2022. August of 2022 would prove to be the last time we saw any significant content for Solo, with the introduction of a new raid, a new dungeon, and a new PvP arena. By the turn of the next year, the population had shrunk to an absolute minuscule 250 players peak. This was a stark contrast to what was going on back at home, in China and on the Eastern region front. Solo was putting out more and more new content and the population was positively trending there. It's difficult for Chinese online RPGs to find their way in the West, with lack of representation already serving heavily against them. But another aspect that should be mentioned besides the genre particulars is the actual art style of Solo. The art style in Solo is polarizing. It's high fantasy Chinese mythology style, and that's a very particular style of game and art. You either love it, or you just don't. There's a reason that MMOs like WoW and SWTOR took much more broadly approachable art styles, because an art direction is taking a stand in the sand, and sometimes that can only have an overall negative effect on the destiny of a given game. I don't think it helps Solo much, but to be honest, there's not much Solo can do about that, as the art style matches the setting and the style of the game. It's just a matter of Westerners having less exposure to it, and having more exposure to anime and Korean anime, which is just unfortunate for Chinese games and art in general. As you can see from the gameplay footage, it's just gorgeous. Solo would announce a shutdown rather abruptly, June 1st, 2 years after the game's original Western launch, set for later in the same month. While the shutdown was announced and would come abruptly, it wasn't a total surprise to those following the project given the game's failing population. And the reasons stated for why are some of the obvious ones that we have been pointing out. They just couldn't garner enough players to move the needle enough for it to be worth it for them as a company. Them being Gameforge in this case, because remember, the original developer Autogon is still raking in the cash from their launch back home. Solo would shut down quickly, June 30th, just 30 days later essentially, 2023, making it a rather quick shutdown on the series, lasting much shorter than far more troubled games. In most cases, when it comes to online RPGs, there are significant efforts to preserve the games, especially if they are beloved ones, small or large. As of the fall of 2023, there are no private servers for Solo in circulation, with most people who are trying to play the game at this point playing on the Chinese servers. It's a rather unceremonious end to arguably the best Chinese online RPG ported to the West yet. But as we have talked about before, with some companies, they aren't interested in the other markets past just making as much money with as little effort as possible. This is something that I've talked about with NCSoft and Nexon. They're great examples of this, making only small fractions of their profits from the Western markets. So while there are ways that Solo could have been better brought to the West to greater success, unless Autogon actually wanted to do that, well, then the game was likely to satisfy some of their interest in porting it over, but never enough to convince them to change strategies or, well, not abandon the game in the West in the first place. And sure, to be fair, it could be a matter of, well, they went to a developer who has experience working with Korean and Eastern games. But at the same time, at this point, it's like, come on, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese developers, it's time to start doing some research into the Western market and how if you don't, it's going to heavily affect your game. Anyway, the tunes are playing detectives, which means that it's time for us to solve this case. Poor marketing and a marketing strategy. Poor localization and cultural adaptations. A unique art style. Western version was ran by essentially a contractor. It came to the West years after launch. It had a lack of long-term progression systems. High system requirements made sure to keep some players out. Solo is a disappointing story for me, as I am constantly let down by quality games that don't have the proper effort or care given to bringing them to a different audience. And Solo was the best thing we've seen online RPG-wise from China, and I was excited to see what they were capable of. In the end, I felt like we kind of got sloppy seconds I have complained about historically from other games ported from Korea, also years after the original launches. And that might sound harsh because I enjoyed Solo for the short time that I did play it, and I think that there is some quality there, but the biggest issues that I have that the game suffers from were there since the very beginning. Just like Gameforge and their handling of it. I'm inclined to believe this was a fantastic IPM project given to just the wrong developer, which also contributed heavily to the mistakes that were made, and thus the game's fate in the West. Thanks for watching.
Do you think things will ever go back to normal?
Would you want to go back to normal?